Okay, thank you to the conference organizers and to Tanoi and Gavaji and Hannah for organizing this really cool session. So our presentation today is the archaeology of climate inequality. The origin of this conference paper has to do with the fact that we felt there are very few papers in archaeology that address contemporary global warming, right? So there are quite a few that might address climate change in the past, but very few that address it today. And we felt that archaeology must have some role, probably not a big one, but must have some role in addressing global warming, especially since it is, in my opinion, and the opinion of many, the real greatest challenge of 21st century life. Yeah. So what we're going to do in this presentation is we're going to kind of throw things throw some things out there, try to think of some ideas that archaeologists could do to tackle climate change in the present. So firstly, I'm going to briefly talk about climate inequality, just to introduce it. Then Nathan will do the second part of the presentation. We'll introduce a theoretical framework that archaeologists might use to address climate change. And then I'm going to go through two case studies where I'll explore a few different ways that archaeologists might address climate change. So this presentation is not exactly research output, but rather we're posing some ideas to you in the archaeological community. Right. So I'm pretty sure that everyone in the audience will be familiar with the negative impacts of greenhouse gas emissions, so I'm not going to go over that. But I do want to address climate inequality, which is this idea that the countries that have contributed the most to greenhouse gas emissions since 1751 to the present have been countries like USA and China and countries in the EU, and yet these are the countries that often suffer the least from global warming. And meanwhile, countries that suffer the most from global warming are often the ones that have contributed the fewest greenhouse gases. So, for example, as you can see in some of these pictures here, flooding that happens from sea level rise really impacts island nations like the Maldives or Tuvalu in Oceania. Even though, as you can see, these are the countries that have contributed far less than 1% to greenhouse gas emissions. They're the ones that are threatened of being made uninhabitable. Yeah, desertification affects countries and say that's a hell, even though, again, those are the countries that have contributed less than 1% to greenhouse gas emissions. The same goes on for wildfires or for disease propagation, since, for example, mosquitoes are able to live in more warm and tropical places as the planet heats up. There's a great injustice in that the countries that have contributed, again, the most to greenhouse gas emissions are often those that suffer the least. And we're not naive, and I'm not surprised that global warming hasn't been solved yet. It is an incredibly difficult problem. Yeah, probably the most difficult that humans have faced. It's not obvious to the senses. It's far away in space and time, affecting people who we in this audience will never meet. It requires solutions that affect different people in different ways, in different circumstances. And whatever decisions that we choose to make to solve the problem, the consequences of those decisions will not be immediate, visible, or local. And climate change is so viscous, so sticky, that it adheres to everything that touches it, the places we live in, the places we work, everything that we do almost in every hour of our waking life contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. And our traditional ways of thinking, it seems, are not good at solving the problem. So that brings me to Nathan's section, where I'll talk about hyperobjects as a theoretical framework for reconceptualizing the problems of climate change.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. So the problem of climate change has actually been addressed philosophically rather recently in Timothy Morton's book, Hyperobjects, which I have a copy of here. It's a very fantastic read. Climate change has often been considered as a concept that describes all these multiple things that are happening and that culminate in a warming of the planet, but it often leaves us with disjointed approaches of tackling climate crisis as different political traditions prioritize different factors over others. Instead, in Hyperobjects, Tim Morton stresses that climate change is a single material beast woven from interconnected web of interacting entities. Hyperobjects, such as climate change, are fairly recognizable from 5 key qualities. So the first one that Brandon already alluded to is that they're viscous. They pervade, they linger, and penetrate, as well as being resilient. Almost everything that happens in the world contributes to global warming, from what we eat and to how we choose to travel. Second, they're non-local. Global warming makes severe weather events more and more common, from wildfires in California and Australia, floods in Pakistan, and the desertification of West Africa. There's no manifestation of a hyperobject that is isolated. Third, they temporarily undulate, and into the fourth, they phase. This phasing in and out brings them into focus at different times. For example, when we had record high temperatures in the UK this year, climate crisis came to the forefront of public agenda. And finally, all hyperobjects have entities that make up this thing, this beast, and they're all acting together in these non-local threads that manifest their own time and space. They are viscous, and they come into focus at moments of great disturbance. Global warming is happening all the time, but we only attend to them in moments of catastrophe. And I think archaeologists themselves are actually already skilled at attending to objects, so why not a hyperobject? But the methods that we've tended to develop have been about creating specific histories and specific stories about things. So things like Bayesian modeling, microanalysis, and local histories talk about the specifics of our stories. But how can we use these methods to study something and entities that we cannot appreciate fully, such as climate change and the hyperobjects? So finally, I think archaeologists are actually already doing this. Archaeologists have had decades of research breaking down nature-culture dichotomy. They've used agency theories and relational archaeology to enmesh humans into larger assemblages. And they're all also already really good at telling narratives from multiple strands of patchy and broken data. So I think there's space for the methods that archaeologists are already using to address some of the problems faced by a hyperobject and therefore climate change. Back to Brandon.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nathan. Right, so the third part of this presentation will bring us through a couple of case studies, both in West Africa. We're going to throw a few ideas at the wall and see what sticks. This is kind of the idea here. So the first is electronic waste in West Africa. And as you can see in this picture, there are mounds and mounds and mounds of it that end up in coastal countries in West Africa. Next slide. So a lot of our information comes from this Basel Convention, which is now 11 years old. So the numbers are actually a bit out of date, and it's probably been higher now, but at least 1 million tons of domestic electronic waste was generated in those 5 countries alone by 2011. Yeah. And the reason that these countries have so much electronic waste is because OECD countries, like the United States, the UK, are exporting what's called near end-of-life equipment. So these phones that work, they're perfectly operational, but they're really, really old and are about to die. And so a lot of these electronics end up in Africa and then end up as waste in those places. You can do next slide. Yeah. So what does that have to do with archaeology? Well, in a way, we can try to think of this as, firstly, a kind of archaeological landscape where we have enormous amounts of waste that are distributed in space, and try to think of those as something that we can study. I'm also quite interested in, this is from a lagoon in Ghana, of how these electronics have been repurposed as stepping stones, yeah, as a way of getting across this lagoon, which is quite interesting and something that archaeologists are quite good at thinking about. Well, I think what's really telling about this particular example of e-waste in Africa is that both archaeologists and climatologists are interested in this full picture of an object. So its production, its distribution, its use, and its deposition, right? Because all those things have greenhouse gas emissions, and all those things are part of a story of an object. In the case of e-waste in Africa, the production and distribution and use of the object all pretty much happen in wealthy nations, right? In the United States or in China or countries like this. And yet the deposition all tends to end up in Western Africa. So there's a kind of global phenomenon here, where actually the story of objects is now a global phenomenon and not a local one. And understanding this kind of comprehensive picture of how artifacts and objects move around the globe is a useful way to help us begin to understand contemporary climate change. And if you think about it, a future archaeologist, if they exist, might come to this place and think, wow, the Gulf of Guinea must have been, like, in the 21st century, the place where electronics happened. But actually, it's not really true. It's just the main place where electronics were deposited. So it's kind of telling to us as archaeologists. And also, on that same line, If you think about these places as like a locality, archaeologists, as Nathan was mentioning, are becoming increasingly interested in telling local histories. But actually, the electronic waste in these lagoons tells very little about that lagoon, but they tell us a lot about global phenomenon of trade and inequality, yeah? Which kind of flips traditional archaeological narratives on its head. We're really approaching here a global archaeology by studying these sites, which I think is really interesting. Okay, next slide. Right. The second case study takes us to Burkina Faso and desertification. Next slide. So there's Burkina Faso in that black circle. Global warming has been shifting precipitation in the region, which makes rainfall there both less common and more irregular. And at the same time, it's rising temperatures in the region that's already pretty hot, which means that a country which was 100 years ago predominantly savanna will be in a couple of decades a country that's predominantly desert, yeah, which is leading to degrading soils and therefore crop failures and therefore displacement, with thousands of people having to migrate to the southern tip of the country or out of the country entirely. Again, that theme of this real great global injustice, since Burkina Faso contributes very little to greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So one concept I like to think about here is what Petersdorfer called the dark side of things, which is how things have lives that endure and outlive us, and how they interact outside our control and domain. And when I think about it, most of the material that archaeologists deal with are not the material that is the most precious to the people of the past, although there are exceptions, but most of the material we deal with is the stuff that's the hardest to get rid of. Yeah, and that's exactly the problem that we face today. If you think about it, greenhouse gases are an object that endure and outlive us and interact outside our control and domain, right? They go out into the atmosphere and it's hard to get rid of them. You think about plastic pollution, the ocean, yeah, the electronic waste in the coast of West Africa is another similar example of these things that have their own lives beyond us. We generate them, but then they outlive us and impact our lives in ways that we didn't intend. And what's cool about this is, I mean, archaeologists wouldn't normally think of gases as the artifact we might study, but greenhouse gases that were emitted by a historical steam engine in the UK in 1752 are part of the hyperobject with desertification in Burkina Faso in 2022. Yeah, and that persistence of things is something that archaeologists are really good at contending with. So it helps us, our archaeologists have a step in the door here of thinking about all these different objects and how they persist as a comprehensive picture. And so we can see that inequality in Burkina Faso is a kind of tangling of all these different historical phenomena that's materialistic, that's colonialism, capitalism, climate change, and archaeologists are in a really good position to really understand the full picture of this inequality because of our familiarity with persistence in material objects. Next slide, please. I also want to touch a little bit on emigration from Burkina Faso due to desertification. Archaeologists long interested in migration, and I think what's quite interesting is what's left behind by the migrants. So I'm actually usually an Anglo-Saxon archaeologist, and people are always interested in what it is that people are bringing with them. And we can tell that people come from land A because they have land A style pots, right? And now they're in land B. But actually, what's also interesting is what are these people leaving behind, yeah, that we're uncovering. And also what's being destroyed by the desert. And Nathan was mentioning how global warming kind of phases in and out of focus depending on what people are thinking about, right? And in the same way, the artifacts left behind are helping us kind of phase in archaeology. If we really are thinking about the material remains of all these different phenomena, for example, emigration from a desert, it's helping bring climate change into our attention so we can attend to it. And it makes it more immediate in a sense. Or at least, perhaps, I'll go back, sorry. Well, actually, yeah, it's all I want to say. Actually, it's pretty good, Jeff. Go next slide. Okay. So to conclude, climate change is a non-human beast that manifests in different ways at different places for different people. That is a hyperobject. Therefore, I think it's quite useful to use Timothy Morton's ideas of hyperobject as a theoretical framework for archaeologists or other people in humanities, or indeed in the sciences, to conceptualize global warming. And so what we want to do in this presentation really is just call upon archaeologists to begin to attend to this, not past climate change, but contemporary catastrophic global warming. Yeah. And a way to do that is we can trace material emergence of climate inequality. We can look at the objects, look at persistence, and begin to tell a story that is extremely comprehensive of global warming. So we can understand the problem better, because remember, it's a very tricky problem. And then once we understand the problem better, we can help the global community, the global academic community, and political community begin to solve that. Yeah. And I think archaeologists are uniquely positioned to tell complex stories. And that was mentioned in a couple of really good presentations yesterday, looking at a museum. Archaeologists have a long tradition of giving voices to victims, as was mentioned in the previous presentation. We can provide comprehensive information. Thank you. And archaeologists are in a prime position to shape the public's way of thinking about problems. Yeah, archaeology ends up in the cover of magazines and in blockbuster museum exhibits and like national museums and capitals that are visited by people all over the world. And so we have the opportunity to both have the public's ear and tell comprehensive stories that give us a really full, strong picture of a really complicated problem and help to bring the public and the political and academic world into a position where we can begin to tackle that problem with a comprehensive understanding. That's actually the sum of our presentation. So I'll hand us back over to the capable hands of our session organizers.